Let's say very good morning to Isabel Oakeshott. Isabel, how are you?
Morning. I'm very well, thank you, though I am really exercised by the sudden departure of Ben Wallace, who was an excellent Defence Secretary, and we really needed that in these times when we're basically looking at war in Europe. And the Prime Minister's decision to replace him with Grant Shapps, I think, is quite extraordinary. Not because Grant Shapps isn't actually, by some measures anyway, a pretty effective minister. He's very energetic, which is more than can be said for a lot of cabinet ministers. He's a very good communicator, and he is able to get things done. And he did stand up as Transport Secretary for a long time to the dreadful unions. But the problem is that he has no background whatsoever in defence. And as someone who's written a book on the state of the armed forces, from a base of zero knowledge, I knew nothing about the armed forces, didn't know one end of a ship from the other. I can say that it is an extraordinarily challenging subject to get your head around. It takes months to understand, even to develop a fundamental understanding of the armed forces. They are absolutely riddled with acronyms. You know, they can't help themselves. It's like a foreign language. He's going to need to go around with a kind of little dictionary explaining what some of the terminology is. I can't see him being able to wrap his head around any of this for probably 6 months. And the Tories likely only have a year left in office. Yeah. There is a war raging. It just seems inexplicable to me.
It really does seem weird, because what you can see with Grant Shapps is the old Margaret Thatcher-style picture of him sitting in a tank with his head poking out the top with a helmet on. Because you might remember that famous picture of Rishi Sunak, and I think it was Zelensky he was with, both getting onto a military helicopter with their kind of, you know, top gun gear on. And that's what it's all about. It's all about photo shoots.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a photo of Liz Truss doing something similar, trying to reprise a kind of Thatcher stance. They all do it. It's frankly embarrassing if they don't have any background in defence. I mean, Ben Wallace is a military man, so he knew what he was talking about. Now, it's not unusual to appoint people with no background in defence to the job. It's happened before. But I think what's different here is the time frame, that it is only a year at the most till the next election, and the fact that we've got a war raging with Russia. So I just find it frankly inexcusable that this decision has been made when there are several people that Rishi Sunak could have chosen who could have gone straight in, rolled up their sleeves and known what they were talking about.
Exactly right. But it then says more about the Prime Minister, does it not, than it actually does about Grant Shapps? Because Grant Shapps will obviously do whatever job he's given. He'll quite happily do his master's bidding and all of that. But this tells you, does it not, that Rishi Sunak simply wants somebody in that role, and in every role, who just does what they're told?
So Rishi Sunak is beginning to remind me ever more of one David Cameron.
Yes.
You know, a guy that essentially sees the role of Prime Minister as a sort of manager, a chief executive. Someone who is there to neutralise problems rather than to actually do something creative to solve the problems. You know, David Cameron famously said that he wanted to neutralise the NHS for the Conservatives. They had a fantastic opportunity to do so much more than so-called neutralise it so it's not a political problem for them, and look how that worked out. They could actually, over the last 12 years, have reformed it. But that isn't how David Cameron saw his job, and nor does it seem to be how this Prime Minister sees his job.
Exactly right. And his first act, of course, is to pledge more money from our Treasury to Ukraine, which is now becoming, I think, more and more of a controversial kind of issue, because more and more people that I speak to are a bit fed up with giving loads of money to Ukraine. And as much as, obviously, people would like to see the war end, they don't want to see endless amounts of billions of pounds leaving this country and going there.
And this is always the difficulty, isn't it? I think there's still publicly, if you polled this, you'd probably still find a really significant majority in favour of continuing to do, quote, whatever it takes to shore up the operation to get Russia out of Ukraine's sovereign territory. But it's always down to how you ask this question, isn't it? You know, if people were asked, you know, would you choose to send more weapons to Ukraine or build X number of new homes in your community, or, you know, an extra hospital wing, or actually make your existing hospital fit for purpose, then I think the answers you'd find would be rather different. You know, people tend to have a slightly kind of vague idea of taxpayers' money until it's put into tangibles. And ultimately, support will wane. And I think people are haunted by Afghanistan and what happened after 20 years of blood and treasure. Yeah. And we've left the place, you know, arguably in some areas in a much worse position than it was 10 years ago.
And we're also reaping the whirlwind of that in terms of the numbers of refugees coming to live in this country or to try and get to this country. Many of them still strapped in Afghanistan, who were supposedly going to be rescued by our government.
Yeah, some people will be mindful of that. Will there be more refugees? Everybody's been incredibly welcoming and supportive of refugees from Ukraine, although it does seem a bit ridiculous that there are certain refugees from Ukraine who now go back to Ukraine on holiday. I mean, I know this anecdotally from people who are still housing Ukrainians, and they kind of disappear for a few weeks, catching up with friends and family in Ukraine. I mean, that can't be right. Either you're here seeking refuge and your country is too difficult to live in, or it's not.
Yeah, you would think so. And also, just on the military front, before we move off that, I see in the Telegraph they're saying there's a whole bunch of new United States fighter jets capable of carrying nuclear weapons going to be stationed in the UK as soon as this year, which is a bit of a surprise, isn't it?
Well, we've always had that very good alliance with the Americans on anything military, and we allow them to use some of our overseas territories for bases. I'm not across the detail of that particular story, but what I do think is interesting is the kind of noises that are coming out of some very influential commentators in America suggesting that that America is heading for war with Russia. Tucker Carlson, formerly of Fox News, very, very famous in America, huge following, is utterly convinced, he said on Twitter this week, that there will be a war within the next year between the US and Russia. Make of that what you will. But I think it's always interesting when people like that, who are very well connected, feel very sure that something like that is going to happen. You have to give it some thought, don't you, as to whether there might be some credibility.
Well, this is why people like Peter Hitchens constantly call for some kind of peace deal, some kind of end to the war, albeit risking that you get called a sort of Putin sympathiser and a Putin appeaser, because in the end, it can only escalate into something like that, really.
Or does it just drift on, a war of attrition, which is really what's been going on in Ukraine since 2014, you know, with the annexation of Crimea. And I sort of think that is a more likely scenario, that it just sort of peters out a bit, but what's going to be left of Ukraine anyway? You know, what are they fighting over? You know, a bunch of razed cities on the Russian side, and on the Ukrainian side, they're fighting for their homeland. So they're not going to give up. And meanwhile, certainly President Putin's hardly going to admit defeat.
He really isn't. The appointment of Grant Shapps to be the new Secretary of State for Defence, it looks as though somebody called Claire Coutinho, who I don't know too much about, she's been working as a Minister for Education apparently, is likely to be confirmed as Energy Secretary, Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary. That's another one which is kind of like, well, so what? You know, what does she know? I've had a look at her Twitter account, and she seems to be talking mostly about childminders and how important it is that they get paid more.
Well, in a sense, I hope she doesn't know anything, because then hopefully she won't be able to do too much harm. Claire Coutinho, the main thing to know about her is that she is exceptionally close to Rishi Sunak, was very much part of his close team during COVID times, and this will be an appointment, a very personal appointment of a close ally. She's pretty young, former special advisor, I think, to Rishi Sunak, very clever. But, you know, you and I probably share the same views of net zero ministers. I don't want any net zero ministers. I think they'll achieve net zero nothing, really.
Yes, I know.
Net quite simply.
It is just dreadful, isn't it? This kind of race to something that nobody can actually identify. It's almost like they're running around looking for the emperor's new clothes and not find them. We go, but we must keep looking. We must head there. We must get there. We must be able to tell people we've done it. It's almost like every other government announcement now, like the one yesterday about, forcing, suspects or convicted criminals to come and face the music. Judges have already got that right. Judges have already got the ability to order that to happen. So the fact that they're now actually saying there's a new law in place to do it, to make it happen, will change absolutely nothing.
Well, and similarly with all this new supposed crackdown on jagged machetes and so-called zombie knives, successive Home Secretaries have announced these things. Nothing ever changes. We were talking about this on the talk last night, the question of judges and the power to force defendants or those convicted of crimes to come up and hear and face their victims, come up from the police cells. I think it's a surprise to many people that they were ever allowed just to sit in their cells and let justice happen while they sit downstairs and read a book or eat Haribo or whatever it is they do in their cells. The problem here is that unless the courts are encouraged or even ordered to literally drag these people up from the cells physically, they're simply not going to do it, are they? Just because they're being told, oh, you'll get an extra year on your sentence if you don't come up and show your face in the dock. Well, if these people are already facing 20 years in jail, an extra year probably doesn't mean anything to them at that point. I think that they should be physically dragged up there. After all, in any town centre on a Friday night or a Saturday night, the police do physically bundle people away from streets and into police cars. So why can't we physically bundle people up from the cells and into the docks, and let's make a spectacle of it?
I said to Kevin O'Sullivan this morning, and I meant it quite convincingly, that the lawyers in this country seem to have taken over every single aspect of everything that we do. There's always a lawyer that will pop up and tell the convicted criminal, we don't have to do that. Just resist and just tell them you're not doing it. It's against your human rights. And then suddenly all bets are off. It's the lawyers who are ruining the migrant situation. It's the lawyers who are ruining the justice system in this country. And it's probably lawyers that are ruining what the police do.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I think that there is, a big new campaign to be done against the lawyers. And they are an absolutely insidious profession, charging us all for basic tasks, vast amounts of money, whilst upending the fundamentals of this country. We saw it during Brexit. We had, our learned friends doing their very best to aid and abet the thwarting of Brexit, a process that ultimately they failed in, at least technically, but continues apace. And, each and every day their presence becomes more malignant and more American style, really. Not just the fear of, not just what lawyers do, but the fear of what they might do is distorting the way the country is run.
I think that's absolutely right. And one story I did want to run past you is on the front page of the Times today. Most people die. More than half of all people who died in England last year were on an NHS waiting list. And I know that you write about the NHS quite a bit. You've written about it recently. You've had dealings with the NHS for some time over recent years. This is a shocking statistic, isn't it?
Well, it is and it isn't. In a sense, waiting for people to die or their problems to self-resolve has always been a method of reducing or managing waiting lists. And, there is a small bit of justification in the category of waiting for problems to resolve, because the human body is a remarkable thing, and sometimes it does heal itself in the long period between being told you need to see a specialist and any hope of actually seeing someone. But of course, that shouldn't be the way we deal with patients. The other thing in defence of this situation, if there is any defence to be had, is that many of those people who died on NHS waiting lists will already be extremely elderly. So in their 80s, for example, and I have a very elderly relative currently receiving, I have to say, very good treatment in hospital. And it is astonishing what the NHS will continue to throw at people who are very, very frail and have multiple issues. in a sense, no money is no object. You know, they're still offered endless scans, operations and procedures. So it doesn't surprise me that the brilliant way in which we don't give up on very elderly and frail people, we continue trying to make them better, means that at any one time, perhaps even most of them are on a waiting list for something.
Well, yeah, and that's going to be for a long time.
Doesn't mean it's okay that many other people are dying unnecessarily while waiting ludicrous lengths of time.
And I think that's the story, really. But we'll come back to that in a sec. We can now confirm, so we can say, actually, Isabel, that your wish is Rishi Sunak's command, because he has made Claire Coutinho Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero. We await her first pronouncement, because Grant Shapps' first one was that he was going to give all money to Ukraine, so we'll see what she's got to say for herself. Meanwhile, Damien Hines has also been seen walking in to Downing Street. I have to say, I can just give a huge sigh and a kind of shrug about all of this, to be honest.
Oh, me too. I mean, is this now beginnings of a proper full-scale reshuffle? Because if so, that would make sense in the run-up to party conference and the start of the new political season. Because if not, if he still plans to do any kind of reshuffle before the next election, the whole of party conference is going to be overshadowed. People wondering if they're going to be in the job for more than the next couple of weeks.
You've just reminded me that party conference season is practically upon us. You've made that's made me even more depressed, I'm afraid. But listen, Isabel, great to see you. Thank you very much.
Go to it. I probably will be.
Oh God, yeah. I almost had to go to a Labour Party conference, but luckily I was dashed at the last minute.